November 14, 1944. A cold rain fell across Fort Campbell, Tennessee, as three canvas-covered transport trucks rolled through the gates of the newly established prisoner of war facility. Inside the lead vehicle, 23-year-old Rosemarie Werner pressed her thin frame against the wooden bench, her gray auxiliary uniform hanging loose on shoulders that had once carried more weight. She clutched a small tin canteen that had been empty for 2 days, listening to the rhythm of rain against canvas while trying to ignore the hollow ache in her stomach that had become her constant companion. The war had been kind to no one, but it had been particularly cruel to the women of the German Auxiliary Corps. Captured during the chaotic retreat through France, Rosemarie and 47 other women had spent the last 6 weeks being processed through various holding facilities, each stop offering less food than the last. The rations that sustained them barely qualified as meals. Thin soup with questionable vegetables, hard bread that required soaking to chew, and occasionally a sliver of cheese that tasted more of mold than milk. Beside her sat 21-year-old Christiane Lehmann, her best friend since their training days in Bonn. Krista's once bright blue eyes had dulled with exhaustion and malnutrition. She had stopped complaining about the hunger 3 weeks ago, which worried Rosemarie more than the complaints ever had. When people stopped talking about their suffering, it meant they had accepted it as permanent. The truck lurched to a stop. American voices barked orders outside, incomprehensible but clearly commanding. The canvas flap pulled back, revealing a tall American sergeant with kind eyes that seemed at odds with his stern expression. He gestured for them to exit, his movements patient rather than aggressive. Rosemarie had expected cruelty from her captors. She had been taught that Americans were barbaric, interested only in domination and humiliation. Yet so far, the Americans had been firm but not cruel, organized but not sadistic. The women filed out into the rain, forming a ragged line in the mud. Rosemarie counted 48 women total, ranging in age from 19 to 35. Most had served as radio operators, administrative clerks, or nurses. None had been combat soldiers, yet here they stood as prisoners of war, enemy aliens in a foreign land that felt impossibly far from home. Among them was 28-year-old Adelheid Vogel, the oldest in their group, and something of a mother figure to the younger women. Heidi stood with her characteristic dignity intact despite the rain soaking through her uniform. She had worked in military logistics in Karlsruhe, managing supply chains that she now realized had been starving even as they attempted to feed the Wehrmacht. The irony was not lost on her. Captain James Morrison stepped forward to address them. His words were translated by a German-speaking private, a young man who stumbled over some phrases but conveyed the essential message. They were now under American custody, subject to the Geneva Convention, and would be treated according to international law. They would be given quarters, assigned work duties, and provided with necessary supplies. But it was his final statement that caught everyone's attention. Dinner would be served in 1 hour. The women were led to a long wooden barracks that would serve as their quarters. Inside, they found rows of metal cots with actual mattresses, thin but present. Wool blankets lay folded at the foot of each bed, and small wooden lockers stood beside them for personal belongings. Rosemarie ran her hand across the mattress, feeling the give of something softer than the concrete floors and straw pallets she had expected. Krista claimed the cot next to hers, already pulling off her wet uniform jacket. "We have blankets, Rose, 2 blankets each." Her voice carried disbelief, as if abundance in captivity made no sense. In Germany, civilians were lucky to have 1 blanket as winter approached. Here, as prisoners, they were being given 2. Heidi moved through the barracks with her efficient manner, helping younger women settle in and organizing their meager possessions. She paused at a window that looked out over the compound. Beyond their barracks stood several other buildings, including what appeared to be a mess hall with smoke rising from its chimney. The scent drifting on the air made her stomach clench with recognition and longing. Something was cooking, and it smelled like meat. An American guard appeared at the door, a young woman in military uniform who introduced herself as Corporal Patricia Henderson. She would be their primary liaison, she explained through the translator. She pointed out the latrine facilities, the washroom with actual running water, and the posted schedule for daily activities. Her manner was businesslike but not unkind, treating them as people rather than despised enemies. The hour passed slowly for women whose minds could focus on nothing but the promised meal. Rosemarie changed into a dry uniform from her small pack, one of only two she owned. She tried to comb her dark blonde hair, which had grown lank from weeks of inadequate nutrition and poor hygiene. Beside her, Krista braided her own light brown hair with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving automatically through a routine that provided comfort in its familiarity. When the bell finally rang for dinner, the women filed out of the barracks in an orderly line. They had been soldiers in service to the Reich, and even in captivity, they maintained their discipline. But as they approached the mess hall, that discipline began to crack. The smells growing stronger with each step were unlike anything they had experienced in months. Rich, savory aromas that spoke of abundance rather than scarcity. Heidi noticed several women walking faster, their pace unconsciously quickening toward wives, the source of those impossible smells. She gently reminded them to maintain formation, but her own stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. Whatever waited inside that building, it represented something none of them had dared to hope for. The doors opened and steam billowed out into the cool November evening, carrying with it scents that would change everything these women believed about their captivity, their enemy, and the nature of the war they had lost. Rosemarie Werner stepped through the mess hall doors and stopped so abruptly that Krista nearly collided with her from behind. The sight before them seemed impossible, a hallucination born of hunger and exhaustion. Long tables stretched the length of the room, and at the far end, American soldiers stood behind serving stations loaded with food. Not the thin gruel or stale bread they had expected, but actual food in quantities that defied belief. The line moved forward in stunned silence. German women who had maintained stoic dignity through capture, processing, and transport now stood speechless before metal trays being filled by American mess staff. The first woman in line, a young radio operator named Elizabeth, simply stared as a large spoonful of mashed potatoes landed on her tray, then green beans glistening with butter, then a thick slice of meatloaf that must have weighed half a pound. Rosemarie watched as Elizabeth's hands began to tremble, the tray shaking so badly that an American private gently steadied it for her. "Keep moving, honey," he said kindly, though she understood no English. "Just keep moving down the line. There's plenty more." When Rosemarie reached the serving station, she found herself unable to meet the eyes of the soldier filling her tray. Shame and confusion warred with desperate hunger. The portions were enormous by any standard, but by German standards of late 1944, they were obscene. Mashed potatoes crowned with a pat of real butter, green beans that had clearly been cooked with actual fat rather than just water. Meatloaf that smelled of beef and spices she had nearly forgotten existed, but it was the bread that nearly broke her composure. White bread, soft and fresh, with a golden crust that released steam when the soldier placed two thick slices on her tray. Not the dense, dark bread stretched with sawdust and potato flour that had become standard in Germany, but bread made from real wheat flour, bread that looked and smelled like something from before the war. Krista received the same portions, her blue eyes wide with disbelief. "Is this real, Rose? Are we seeing this?" Her whispered German carried the edge of hysteria. "Is this actually happening?" They found seats at one of the long tables, joining other women who sat frozen before their trays like children confronted with an incomprehensible adult world. Heidi sat across from them, her usual composure cracked by the reality of the meal before her. She picked up her fork, then set it down. Again, then picked it up once more. Around them, American soldiers ate their own meals with casual indifference, talking and laughing, as if this abundance were normal, as if meals like this happened every single day. Because for them, Rosemarie realized with dawning horror, this was normal. This was ordinary. This was simply dinner on a Tuesday evening in America. Krista sat motionless before her tray, the fork heavy in her hand. The smell of the meatloaf triggered memories she had tried to suppress, carrying her back to the last real meal she had eaten in Bonn. It had been her mother's birthday, March of 1943, nearly 2 years ago. The family had saved ration cards for weeks to afford a small pork roast, no bigger than 2 fists. Her mother had cried when she saw it, knowing that 6 people would share what should have fed 2. That was before the rationing had become truly severe, before the Allied bombing campaigns had disrupted food distribution across Germany, before the word hunger had evolved from discomfort to defining characteristic of daily life. Krista remembered her younger sister, only 14, developing sores at the corners of her mouth from vitamin deficiency. Her father's wedding ring spinning loose on his finger as weight melted away from bodies with nothing to sustain them. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps partly out of patriotic duty, but mostly because military service came with better rations than civilian life. The recruitment officers had promised regular meals, adequate provisions, and the pride of serving the fatherland. They had delivered on the pride, but the regular meals had lasted only until the supply lines began to collapse under Allied pressure. Now she stared at more food on one tray than her entire family would have seen in a week. The mashed potatoes alone represented a luxury beyond measure. Real potatoes. Not the turnip substitutes that had become standard. Real butter. Not the synthetic fat that tasted of chemicals and desperation. The green beans showed no signs of rot or spoilage, no indication that they had been sorted through to remove the inedible portions. Beside her, Rosemarie had finally taken a first bite of the meatloaf. Krista watched her friend's expression transform from disbelief to something approaching anguish. Rose's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously, her throat working to swallow both food and emotion. When she looked at Krista, her expression carried a question neither of them wanted to voice. How could the enemy eat like this while Germany starved? The propaganda had taught them that America suffered too, that the war had brought deprivation to all nations equally, that their sacrifices were matched by similar sacrifices across the Atlantic. But this meal demolished that careful narrative. Americans were not starving. Americans had not forgotten what butter tasted like. Americans could afford to feed their prisoners better than Germany, could feed its own citizens. Across the table, Heidi had begun to eat with slow, deliberate movements. Her face remained carefully neutral, but Krista recognized the expression. Heidi was thinking, processing, recalculating everything she believed about the war and Germany's position in it. Each bite was evidence that contradicted years of certainty. Other women had started eating too, some with desperate speed that suggested fear the food might vanish, others with Heidi's cautious deliberation. But all of them understood that something fundamental had shifted in this moment, that they could not unknow what this meal revealed about the relative strength of the nations at war. The morning after their first dinner, Rosemarie woke to find several women already awake, sitting on their cots and staring at nothing. The night had been restless for everyone. Stomachs unaccustomed to adequate food had cramped and protested, but it was not physical discomfort that had kept them awake. It was the devastating realization of how thoroughly they had been deceived. Breakfast call came at 700 hours. The women dressed in silence and formed their line with mechanical precision. As they walked to the mess hall, Rosemarie noticed that some moved more slowly than others, their bodies struggling to process the sudden influx of nutrition after months of deprivation. Heidi had to support young Elizabeth, whose legs had gone shaky during the night. Inside the mess hall, the American cooks had prepared what they clearly considered a standard breakfast: scrambled eggs, thick strips of bacon, toast with jam, and hot coffee with real cream. For the German women, it was another impossible feast. Rosemarie watched as the server placed 3 strips of bacon on her plate, each piece glistening with fat. In Germany, such a portion of meat would have required a week's worth of ration cards, and even then, you would consider yourself fortunate to obtain it. But it was the butter that finally broke the fragile composure many women had maintained. Each table had small dishes of butter, real butter, in quantities meant for casual spreading on toast. Krista reached for one of the dishes with trembling hands, her fingers touching the smooth yellow surface as if it might disappear. She spread a thin layer on her toast, with the care of someone handling something precious and irreplaceable. Then she saw an American soldier at the next table casually slather his toast with butter, so thick it left visible ridges. He did this without thought, without appreciation, without any awareness that what he was doing would be considered wasteful extravagance in any German household. He simply wanted more butter, so he took more butter, because there was more butter. Krista set down her knife and began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Rosemarie wrapped an arm around her friend's shoulders, but she understood. This was not gratitude for the food. This was grief and rage at the contrast between this abundance and the suffering they had left behind. This was the shattering of every justification they had been given for the war. Around them, other women wept too, some silently, tears running down their faces as they methodically ate breakfast. Others, like Krista, unable to contain the emotion that came with understanding. They had been told that everyone was suffering equally, that the deprivation in Germany was necessary and shared by all combatant nations. They had been told that after victory, abundance would return. But America had never lost its abundance. America had fought a war on 2 fronts while maintaining a standard of living that Germany had not known even before the war began. The butter on their toast was proof of how completely they had misunderstood everything. Private Thomas Chen had been assigned to guard duty at the women's facility precisely because of his temperament. The son of Chinese immigrants who had built a restaurant in San Francisco, he understood what it meant to bridge cultures and to communicate through food when words failed. He had watched the German women's reaction to their meals with a mixture of sympathy and concern. He recognized the signs of prolonged malnutrition in their thin frames and hollow cheeks. On the 3rd day, he approached Corporal Henderson with a suggestion. These women needed more than just adequate calories. They needed their bodies to remember what proper nutrition felt like. He had seen the same hollow desperation in faces at his family's restaurant during the worst years of the Depression. People who had forgotten that food could be something other than fuel for survival. Henderson, a practical woman from Iowa farm country, understood immediately. She authorized Private Chen to spend extra time in the mess hall, teaching the German women not just to eat, but to understand American food. Through the translator, he began explaining the meals as they were served. This is how we prepare green beans in the South. This is a recipe my grandmother brought from China, but adapted for American ingredients. This is what miners in Pennsylvania eat to sustain them through long shifts. Rosemarie found herself drawn to these explanations. Private Chen spoke about food with a reverence she recognized from her own grandmother, who had cooked in Heidelberg before the war. Food was not just sustenance in his stories, it was culture, memory, and connection. He explained that American abundance came not from superior virtue, but from geographic luck. Rich farmland, 2 oceans for protection, no bombed factories or disrupted supply chains. One afternoon, Private Chen brought ingredients to demonstrate how to make his grandmother's egg drop soup. He had obtained permission to conduct a small cooking class, believing it would help the women feel less like passive recipients of American charity. Heidi, Krista, and Rosemarie volunteered, along with other women who had worked in kitchens before the war. Private Chen moved through the steps with practiced ease, explaining each addition to the pot. The broth made from chicken bones that would have been precious in Germany. The eggs swirled in to create delicate ribbons. The green onions, sliced thin and added at the end. He spoke about his grandmother's journey from Guangdong province to California, about adapting recipes to new ingredients, about making home in a foreign place. As the soup simmered, filling the kitchen with savory steam, he asked the translator to convey something important. "My grandmother always said that food is the first language we learn and the last one we forget. You are far from home, but food can help you remember who you are while you figure out who you might become." The women tasted the soup, surprised by flavors that were completely unfamiliar yet somehow comforting. Rosemarie realized that Private Chen was teaching them something beyond cooking. He was showing them that it was possible to honor where you came from while adapting to where you found yourself. December 24, 1944 arrived with snow falling across Fort Campbell. The war in Europe raged on, with German forces launching their desperate Ardennes offensive. But inside the prisoner of war facility, preparations were underway for something the German women had not expected. The Americans were planning a Christmas celebration, and they intended to include their prisoners in the festivities. Captain Morrison had wrestled with the decision. Providing a generous Christmas meal for enemy prisoners while American soldiers fought and died overseas could be seen as inappropriate. But he had observed the transformation beginning in these women, the way their initial hostility had softened into confused gratitude. He believed that showing them the best of American values, even in this small way, might serve the war effort better than harsh treatment. The mess hall had been decorated with pine branches and red ribbons. Someone had fashioned a star from tin foil to hang above the serving line. It was modest by civilian standards, but for the German women, it represented an effort to create beauty and celebration in circumstances that warranted neither. Heidi stood at the barracks window watching American soldiers carry covered dishes into the mess hall, trying to imagine what meal would require such preparation. When the dinner bell rang, the women filed through the snow to the mess hall. Rosemarie noticed that the American soldiers, who usually ate in shifts, had been organized to dine simultaneously with the prisoners. The tables had been arranged differently, with Americans and Germans interspersed rather than separated. It was a small gesture, but one that carried significance beyond its logistics. Captain Morrison stood at the front of the hall to make a brief announcement. The translator conveyed his words carefully. "Tonight we share a meal in the spirit of the season. Whatever differences divide our nations, we can acknowledge our common humanity." The German women listened with expressions ranging from skepticism to tentative hope. Then the serving began, and all other thoughts vanished. The cooks had prepared a feast that seemed to belong to peacetime rather than the 5th year of global war. Turkey, golden brown and glistening, mashed potatoes in quantities that could feed a village, stuffing rich with herbs and butter, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, green bean casserole, rolls so fresh they steamed when broken open. But the centerpiece, the dish that would be remembered and discussed for decades afterward, was the honey-glazed ham. 3 enormous hams, each glazed to a deep mahogany sheen, studded with cloves and pineapple rings. The sweet, savory aroma filled the mess hall with a scent that spoke of abundance, celebration, and a world where such excess was possible. Krista stood in the serving line, watching as a thick slice of ham was placed on her plate. The glaze caught the light, honey and brown sugar, glistening on meat that had been cooked to tender perfection. She looked at Rosemarie with an expression of complete bewilderment. "This is Christmas," she whispered. "They gave us Christmas." Rosemarie sat at the table with her Christmas dinner before her, unable to take the first bite. Around her, women were eating in stunned silence or speaking in hushed German voices that carried tones of disbelief and confusion. The honey-glazed ham dominated her plate, its sweetness perfuming the air. She had seen nothing like it since childhood, before the war, before rationing had reduced German meals to subsistence. The propaganda had been so careful, so consistent. Minister Goebbels had assured the German people that the Allied nations suffered equal deprivation. American factories were crumbling, their farmland failing, their people starving in breadlines while fighting an unjust war against European sovereignty. The newsreels had shown carefully selected images of American poverty, Depression-era photographs presented as current conditions. Every speech, every radio broadcast, every newspaper article had reinforced the narrative that Germany's sacrifices were matched by enemy sacrifices. But here, in December of 1944, with German cities being bombed into rubble and civilians surviving on turnip soup and ersatz bread, the Americans were serving honey-glazed ham to their prisoners of war. Not thin portions carefully rationed, but generous slices from hams large enough to feed dozens, with side dishes that included real butter, real sugar, real cream. Ingredients that had become legendary luxuries in Germany, mentioned in whispers like fairy tale treasures. Heidi had finally begun eating, but her face carried an expression Rosemarie had never seen on the older woman. It was the look of someone whose fundamental understanding of the world had been proven false. Heidi had managed supply logistics for the Wehrmacht. She had seen the reports, knew the shortages, understood the desperate measures being taken to keep soldiers fed. She had believed those shortages were universal, that all nations struggled equally to maintain their forces. This meal proved otherwise. If America could feed prisoners of war with such abundance, what did that say about their capacity to feed their own military? What did it reveal about the relative strength of the two nations? The ham on her plate was not just food. It was evidence of industrial capacity, agricultural surplus, and supply chains that functioned despite years of global warfare. Private Chen walked among the tables, ensuring everyone had enough. He paused at Rosemarie's table, noticing her untouched plate. "You okay, miss?" He gestured to her food with concern. The translator conveyed his question, and Rosemarie found herself responding before she could consider the wisdom of honesty. "We were told that Americans were starving too," she said quietly. "We were told the war had reduced everyone to the same level of deprivation." The translator hesitated before conveying this to Private Chen, but he nodded with understanding rather than anger. "Yeah," he said gently. "I bet they told you a lot of things that weren't true. War makes liars of everyone." The days following Christmas brought an unexpected problem that Captain Morrison had not anticipated. Several of the German women, their bodies still adjusting to adequate nutrition after months of deprivation, began eating with a compulsiveness that bordered on desperation. They took extra portions when available, hoarded bread in their lockers, and approached each meal as if it might be their last. The camp physician, Dr. Samuel Brennan, recognized the behavior as a psychological response to prolonged starvation. Heidi Vogel became one of the most concerning cases. The woman who had maintained such rigid dignity, such careful composure throughout their captivity, began to unravel around food. She would finish her own meal and then watch other women's plates with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. At night, she would wake and eat the bread she had hidden, driven by an anxiety that the abundance might suddenly vanish. Rosemarie found her friend sitting on her cot one morning, surrounded by crumbs and empty wrappers, crying with shame and confusion. "I cannot stop, Rose. I know there will be more food at breakfast. I know the Americans will feed us, but my body does not believe it. My mind does not believe it. I eat and still feel empty." Dr. Brennan called a meeting with Corporal Henderson and several of the women to explain what was happening. Through the translator, he described how prolonged malnutrition affected not just the body, but the mind. The fear of starvation became embedded in survival instincts, creating behaviors that persisted even after the threat had passed. Some women might struggle with this, for months or even years. He was particularly concerned about 3 women who had begun vomiting after meals, their stomachs unable to process the sudden increase in food quantity and richness. Their bodies had adapted to scarcity, and now abundance itself had become a form of illness. He ordered reduced portions for these women, gradually increasing their intake over several weeks to allow their digestive systems to recover. But the psychological component proved harder to address. Krista confessed to Rosemarie that she dreamed about food every night, not pleasant dreams of enjoyable meals, but nightmares where food appeared and then vanished, where she reached for bread that turned to ash in her hands, where she sat at tables laden with feasts she was forbidden to touch. She would wake with her heart racing, needing several moments to remember where she was and that breakfast would actually come. Private Chen, observing these struggles, made another suggestion to Captain Morrison. Perhaps the women needed to participate in food preparation rather than simply receiving it. Helping to cook might give them a sense of control and security around meals. Morrison approved the plan, and within days, a rotation system was established, allowing prisoners to work in the kitchen under supervision. Heidi volunteered immediately, working with food, measuring ingredients, seeing the supplies that ensured tomorrow's meals, brought her a calm she had not felt since the war began. Her hands, which had trembled with anxiety at mealtimes, moved with steady confidence as she kneaded dough or chopped vegetables. Here, surrounded by abundance, she could touch and verify. Her mind finally began to accept what her body had been trying to tell her. The hunger was over. January of 1945 brought the first opportunity for the women to send letters home through the International Red Cross. The regulations were strict. Letters could be no longer than 25 lines, would be censored for military information, and might take months to reach their destinations if they arrived at all. But for women who had been separated from their families since capture, even this limited communication felt like a lifeline to a world they had lost. Rosemarie sat at the table in the barracks common room, a single sheet of paper before her and a pencil worn short from use. She had been trying to write to her mother in Heidelberg for 3 hours, crossing out sentences and starting again. How could she explain what she had experienced? How could she describe the abundance without sounding like she had lost her mind or been seduced by enemy propaganda? "Dear Mama," she began for the 7th time, "I am well and unharmed. The Americans treat us according to the Geneva Convention. We have adequate food and shelter." But the words felt dishonest in their inadequacy. Adequate food. The phrase could not convey the reality of honey glazed ham, real butter, fresh eggs every morning. It could not describe meals that would have fed her entire neighborhood in Heidelberg. Across the table, Krista faced the same struggle. She had written a letter to her mother that described the food in detail, then tore it up, because it read like fantasy or mockery. How could her family, likely surviving on turnip soup and black bread, read about roast turkey and mashed potatoes without feeling betrayed? How could she tell them she had gained 8 pounds in captivity while they were probably still losing weight? Heidi had found a different approach. She wrote to her sister with careful honesty. "The Americans have more than we were told, much more. This does not mean our family was wrong to serve Germany, but it means we were not told the truth about enemy capabilities. I think of you every day and pray you have enough to eat. Please tell Mama I am safe." She did not describe specific meals or quantities. She simply acknowledged the reality that the propaganda had been false. Several women chose not to write at all. Young Elizabeth, whose entire family had died in the bombing of Hamburg, had no one to receive her letters. Others, like Maria Hartmann from Stuttgart, could not bear the guilt of describing their relative comfort while loved one suffered. Maria sat at the table with blank paper, tears falling silently onto the page she could not bring herself to fill. Private Chen, delivering mail supplies, noticed the distress in the room. He spoke quietly to the translator, then addressed the women. "You do not have to tell them everything. You can simply tell them you are alive and thinking of them. Sometimes that is enough, but the women knew it was not enough. Their families deserved to know the truth, even if that truth was almost impossible to believe. The letters that were finally sealed and handed to Corporal Henderson represented careful negotiations between honesty and mercy, between witness and kindness. Each woman had chosen what truth she could bear to tell and what reality she would keep to herself. The words on paper could not capture the full weight of what they had learned, but they were the best compromise between silence and confession that these women could manage. February brought reports from Germany that made the contrast between captivity and homeland even more devastating. Through carefully monitored news sources, the women learned that the German civilian ration had been reduced again. Adults now received approximately 1,000 calories per day, barely enough to sustain basic metabolic functions. Children fared slightly better, but still faced malnutrition on a massive scale. The Ardennes offensive had failed, consuming resources that might have fed cities. Rosemarie read these reports in the camp library, comparing them mentally to the breakfast she had eaten that morning. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with jam, fresh fruit, probably 1,500 calories in that single meal, with lunch and dinner still to come. She felt the food sitting heavy in her stomach, no longer a comfort but an accusation. How dare she eat so well while children in Heidelberg went hungry? The guilt became a constant companion for many of the women. They could not refuse the food without insulting their captors and without harming their own recovery from malnutrition. But they could not accept it without feeling like traitors to the suffering they had left behind. Krista began eating only half her portions, sliding the rest to women who still struggled with hunger anxiety. It was a small gesture, meaningless in the larger context, but it helped her feel less complicit in the abundance. Heidi articulated what many felt during a conversation in the barracks. Every meal here is a betrayal. We sit in warmth and eat more than enough while our families freeze and starve. We are prisoners who live better than free Germans. What does that make us? No one had an answer because the question was fundamentally unanswerable. They were trapped in a moral paradox where accepting care felt like abandonment and refusing it served no purpose beyond self-punishment. Captain Morrison became aware of the guilt affecting his prisoners when several women requested permission to reduce their rations and send the savings home to Germany. He had to explain that such a thing was impossible. Food could not be transferred from American military stocks to German civilians. The war was still being fought. Supply lines did not work that way. But he understood their need to do something, anything, to alleviate the guilt of their full stomachs. Dr. Brennan warned that some women were beginning to show signs of depression linked to survivor guilt. They had survived capture when others had died. They ate well while loved ones starved. They slept in heated barracks while German cities burned under Allied bombs. The psychological weight was becoming as damaging as the earlier malnutrition had been. Private Chen, observing the change in the women's demeanor, shared his own family's story. During the Depression, his parents' restaurant had fed wealthy customers, while Chinese immigrants in their neighborhood went hungry. His grandmother had felt the same guilt, the same sense of betrayal in accepting money for food while others starved. She had resolved it by feeding those who could not pay, by finding ways to share abundance even when sharing seemed impossible. But what abundance could these prisoners share? They were enemy nationals confined to a military facility with no resources beyond what their captors provided. They could not feed German civilians or warm German homes or prevent German suffering. All they could do was survive their captivity and bear witness to the truth they had learned. March brought warmer weather and a shift in the relationship between the German prisoners and their American guards. The initial tension had faded, replaced by something more complex. Shared meals had created a familiarity that transcended the boundaries of captor and captive. Private Chen's cooking lessons had evolved into genuine cultural exchange, with German women teaching American soldiers about their own culinary traditions, adapted to available American ingredients. Rosemarie found herself in the kitchen one afternoon helping Private Chen prepare dinner for the entire facility. She was explaining how her grandmother made Kartoffelpuffer, potato pancakes, when she realized she was actually laughing for the first time since her capture. Private Chen was attempting to pronounce the German name with such earnest difficulty that she could not help but find it amusing. He grinned at her reaction, pleased to have lightened her perpetual sadness. The potato pancakes they made together used American potatoes, which were larger and different in texture than German varieties. The recipe required adjustment, collaboration, and compromise. As they worked side by side, Rosemarie noticed that she had stopped thinking of Private Chen as her captor. He had become simply Thomas, a young man far from his own home who understood what it meant to build bridges between cultures through food. Krista had formed a similar connection with Corporal Henderson, who had taught her to make apple pie, an American dessert that seemed to hold almost sacred significance in United States culture. Henderson spoke about her mother's pies, about church socials and harvest festivals, and the way food brought communities together on Iowa farms. Krista recognized the same reverence for food traditions that existed in German culture, the same understanding that meals meant more than nutrition. Heidi's friendship with Dr. Brennan had deepened through discussions about nutrition and healing. He valued her insight into German food systems and how wartime deprivation had affected civilian health. She appreciated his clinical understanding that treated food as medicine as well as sustenance. Together, they developed meal plans specifically designed to help the women recover from malnutrition without overwhelming their damaged digestive systems. These connections complicated everything. It was easier to maintain the clarity of war when enemies remained abstract, faceless, fundamentally different. But the Americans who fed them, who taught them recipes, who laughed at their mispronunciations and corrected their English with patience, were not the monsters propaganda had described. They were simply people, no more inherently evil or good than the German people themselves. One evening, during a group dinner where Germans and Americans sat interspersed at the tables, someone began singing. It started with an American soldier tentatively offering the opening lines of a folk song. Then a German woman joined with harmony, not understanding the words but following the melody. More voices added, German and English, mixing in sounds that preceded language, that spoke to something older and more fundamental than national identity. Private Chen turned to Rosemarie with a serious expression. You know what this is? This is how wars should end, not with more hatred, but with recognition that we are all just trying to feed ourselves and the people we love. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, understanding that food had done what force never could. It had made them see each other as human. Staff Sergeant William Tucker had been cooking in military kitchens for 12 years, but the women's facility at Fort Campbell presented a challenge he had never encountered. These were not soldiers accustomed to mess hall portions or prisoners hardened by long captivity. These were women emerging from starvation, for whom every meal carried psychological and political weight he barely understood. But Tucker understood food, and he understood that his role went beyond simply filling stomachs. Rosemarie had been working kitchen detail for 3 weeks when Tucker began teaching her the deeper principles of his craft. He showed her how to evaluate ingredients, how to adjust recipes for available supplies, how to make decisions that balanced nutrition with morale. But more importantly, he talked about why food mattered in ways that transcended hunger. His words, filtered through the translator, revealed a philosophy Rosemarie had never considered. In America, Tucker explained, food is democracy. We believe everyone should have enough, that abundance should be shared, that no one should go hungry if we can prevent it. It is not perfect, and we fail this ideal often. But it is what we strive toward. Rosemarie thought about German food policy, about rationing based on productivity and value to the state, about how some received more because they were deemed more important. She had accepted this as necessary efficiency, never questioning the underlying philosophy. Tucker taught her to make cornbread, an American staple she had never encountered. As they mixed cornmeal with buttermilk and eggs, he spoke about his grandmother, a freed slave who had cooked for white families in Mississippi while barely feeding her own children. She taught me that food is power, he said. Who eats and who goes hungry, who cooks and who is served. These things tell you everything about a society's values. The conversation challenged Rosemarie's understanding of why America had such abundance. She had assumed it was purely geographic luck or perhaps greed and exploitation. But Tucker described a system where farmers were subsidized to produce surplus, where government programs fed children in schools, where the stated goal was enough food for everyone, even if the execution fell short. Germany had organized its food system around military necessity and racial hierarchy. America, with all its flaws and contradictions, had organized around an ideal of shared abundance. One afternoon, Tucker made Rosemarie an offer that would change her trajectory. When this war ends, people like you are going to be needed. People who understand both scarcity and abundance, who can bridge German and American food cultures. You have a gift for this work. Do not waste it. She had never considered that her experience in this kitchen might have value beyond survival, that the skills she was learning might constitute a future rather than simply a means of passing time. Tucker's influence extended beyond Rosemarie. Other women working kitchen detail absorbed his philosophy, learning that food could be a force for equity rather than control, for connection rather than division. They began to understand American abundance not as evidence of superiority, but as the result of choices about how society organized itself. April brought devastating news from Europe that shattered whatever remained of the German women's faith in the cause they had served. American forces had liberated concentration camps, and the photographs began appearing in newspapers and military briefings. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, names that meant nothing to the women until they saw the images of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, and systematic extermination facilities. Captain Morrison made the difficult decision to share these reports with the prisoners, believing they deserved to know the truth. Rosemarie sat in the camp library with Krista and Heidi, the three of them staring at newspaper photographs that seemed to depict something beyond human comprehension. These were not military casualties or collateral damage from bombing campaigns. These were deliberate, organized systems of murder on a scale that defied belief. The prisoners in the photographs looked worse than the German women had looked at their hungriest moment. These were people who had been systematically starved, worked to death, and executed. "We did not know," Krista whispered, but the words sounded hollow even as she spoke them. How could we not know? How could something this massive exist without our knowledge? Heidi's face had gone completely pale, her usual composure shattered. She had managed Wehrmacht logistics, had seen supply requisitions, had processed orders. She had never questioned what the trains were carrying or where certain supplies were directed. She had simply done her job efficiently, trusting that her role served Germany's defense. The photographs showed American soldiers forcing German civilians to tour the camps, to witness what had been done in their name. Local residents claimed ignorance, insisted they had no idea such places existed so close to their homes. But the images also showed the infrastructure required for such operations, the rail lines, the supply chains, the administrative systems. This was not hidden. It had simply been ignored by those who did not want to see. Rosemarie thought about the propaganda films she had watched, the speeches she had applauded, the certainty she had felt that Germany fought for its survival against enemies who wished to destroy it. She remembered cheering when her unit was told they were serving the fatherland's defense. Now she understood she had been serving something monstrous, something that had used her patriotism and idealism to fuel machinery of death. Other women gathered around the newspapers, their reactions ranging from denial to horror to grief. Some insisted the photographs must be propaganda, that Americans had staged these scenes to justify their invasion. But the images were too detailed, too numerous, too consistent across multiple sources. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Young Elizabeth, whose family had died in Hamburg, pointed at the photographs with shaking hands. "This is what we fought for? This is what my parents died defending?" Private Chen found Rosemarie later that evening, sitting alone outside the barracks. She had been crying for hours, her eyes swollen and red. He sat beside her without speaking, simply present in her grief. Finally, she turned to him with a question that would haunt her for years. "How do you live with this knowledge?" May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years had finally ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. Across America, celebrations erupted with the same joy that had marked the false armistice rumors of previous years. But in the women's facility at Fort Campbell, the end of war brought not celebration, but profound uncertainty about the future. Captain Morrison called an assembly in the mess hall where the women had first encountered American abundance 6 months earlier. The 48 prisoners gathered with faces that reflected the psychological journey they had undergone. They were no longer the defiant, proud members of the Women's Auxiliary Corps who had arrived in November. They were women who had learned truths that had destroyed their understanding of everything they had believed and served. Morrison's announcement was brief and factual. The war in Europe had ended. Germany had surrendered. Repatriation procedures would begin within weeks. All prisoners of war would be processed for return to their homeland. The women listened in silence, but Rosemarie noticed something unexpected in their expressions. There was no relief, no joy at the prospect of freedom and return home. Instead, she saw fear, confusion, and something that looked remarkably like dread. After Morrison dismissed the assembly, the women remained seated, no one willing to be the first to voice what they were all thinking. Finally, Heidi spoke the question aloud. What are we returning to? Germany was devastated, occupied by foreign armies, its cities in ruins, its economy collapsed, its political system destroyed. The families they might return to were likely scattered, dead, or surviving in conditions worse than the poverty they had known before the war. But beyond the practical concerns lay something deeper and more troubling. These women had spent 6 months learning that everything they had been told about the war was false. They had discovered that American abundance was real, while German superiority was propaganda. They had seen photographs of concentration camps and understood that they had served a regime guilty of crimes beyond comprehension. They had formed genuine connections with Americans who had treated them with more dignity than their own government had shown to those it deemed undesirable. Krista articulated what many felt. How do we go back and pretend we do not know these things? How do we face people who still believe the propaganda? How do we explain that we ate honey-glazed ham while they starved? That Americans fed us better than Germany ever did? They would see us as traitors, as corrupted by enemy influence, as weak women who betrayed the fatherland. Rosemarie added another concern. And what will we find when we return? Her mother's last letter, received through the Red Cross in March, had described Heidelberg as barely recognizable. The university was closed, most buildings damaged, food almost non-existent. Her father had died in an air raid the previous October. She would return to a city of strangers and ruins, to a life that no longer existed. The choice they faced was not between captivity and freedom. It was between hunger and shame, between physical deprivation and moral compromise. June 15, 1945. Captain Morrison stood before the assembled German women with documents that would determine their futures. The repatriation schedule had been finalized. Transport ships would begin carrying prisoners back to Europe within 3 weeks. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in France before being released into occupied Germany. Each woman would receive basic supplies, documentation, and instructions for locating family members through Red Cross services. Rosemarie listened to the announcement with her hands clenched in her lap. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, she would board a ship that would carry her away from honey-glazed ham and fresh bread, away from the abundance that had become both comfort and accusation. She would return to a Germany she no longer recognized to serve penance for crimes she had unknowingly supported. But as Morrison continued speaking, Rosemarie noticed Heidi's expression changing. The older woman's face had taken on a look of quiet determination that Rosemarie recognized from their days managing difficult logistics. Heidi was calculating, weighing options, considering possibilities that others had not yet imagined. When Morrison asked if there were questions, Heidi stood slowly. "Captain, may I speak with you privately after this assembly?" Morrison nodded, clearly surprised by the request. The meeting concluded, and women dispersed to their barracks in subdued groups. But Heidi remained, waiting as the mess hall emptied. Rosemarie and Krista lingered near the door, uncertain whether to leave their friend alone. What followed would become legendary in the facility's history. Heidi asked Morrison a question that no prisoner of war had apparently ever posed to an American commander. Is it possible for prisoners to request delayed repatriation? Morrison stared at her in confusion. Heidi continued carefully, her English now fluent after months of practice. Some of us have no families to return to. Some of us would face persecution for being captured. Some of us believe we could serve better purposes here, helping to process other displaced persons, using our language skills and cultural knowledge. Morrison had no immediate answer. The Geneva Convention provided for repatriation of prisoners after hostilities ceased. It did not contemplate prisoners requesting to remain in captivity. He promised to consult with his superiors and with legal advisors. But Heidi's question had opened a door that others had been afraid to approach. That evening, Heidi gathered 12 women in the barracks. These were women who had lost everyone, who faced return to nothing, who had found in American captivity something they feared losing more than they feared the stigma of refusing repatriation. Together, they began drafting a letter that would challenge every assumption about loyalty, belonging, and the meaning of home. They chose full plates over empty patriotism. The letter took 3 days to compose. 13 women contributed, each adding her reasons, her circumstances, her justification for the unprecedented request. Rosemarie found herself part of this group almost without conscious decision. Krista joined because Rosemarie did, unwilling to separate from the friend who had sustained her through captivity. Heidi organized their arguments with the same efficiency she had once applied to Wehrmacht logistics. They addressed their petition to Captain Morrison, but intended it for whoever would ultimately decide their fate. "We understand this request is unusual," Heidi had written in careful English. "We understand it may be denied, but we believe we have the right to choose where we build our futures, and we choose America. Not because we love Germany less, but because we have learned that the Germany we loved never truly existed." The letter detailed their circumstances. Rosemarie's father was dead, her mother's situation unknown. Krista's family in Bonn had not responded to Red Cross inquiries for months. Elizabeth had no living relatives. Others faced similar voids where family had once existed. They argued they would burden already strained German resources, while in America they could contribute immediately through translation work, cultural mediation, and assistance with the thousands of displaced persons flooding Allied zones. But the heart of their argument was more philosophical. They had been taught that Americans were enemies, barbaric and cruel. Instead, they had found Americans who fed them generously, treated them with dignity, and offered them chances for redemption rather than punishment. They had seen American abundance and American generosity operating on principles fundamentally different from what they had known. They wanted to be part of a society that organized itself around those principles. Morrison read their letter with visible emotion. He had watched these women transform from hostile prisoners to something approaching friends. He had seen them grapple with devastating truths about their homeland. He understood that sending them back to starvation and stigma felt wrong, regardless of legal technicalities. He forwarded their petition to Washington with his own strong recommendation for approval. The response took 2 weeks. During that time, the other women divided between sympathy and accusation. Some understood the choice. Others saw it as ultimate betrayal, abandonment of duty when Germany needed rebuilding most. Arguments erupted in the barracks. A few women stopped speaking to the petitioners entirely. When Morrison finally called the 13 women to his office, his expression was carefully neutral. Washington had approved an experimental program. The women could be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. They would need sponsors, employment, and permanent housing within 6 months. They would face intensive scrutiny and restrictions on movement, but they could stay. Rosemarie felt relief and guilt in equal measure. 20 years later, Rosemarie Werner Harrison stood in the kitchen of her Connecticut home preparing Thanksgiving dinner for a gathering that would have seemed impossible in 1945. Her husband Robert, an American veteran she had met while working as a translator, carved the turkey with practiced ease. Their 3 children set the table, chattering in English with Connecticut accents that still occasionally startled her. And seated in the living room, speaking German with Krista and her family, was Heidi, now a respected nutritionist who had dedicated her career to studying the psychological effects of starvation. The honey-glazed ham that had defined their first American Christmas had become a tradition in Rosemarie's home. Every holiday, she prepared it exactly as Staff Sergeant Tucker had taught her, the recipe a tangible connection to the moment her understanding of the world had fundamentally shifted. Her children knew the story by heart, how their mother had been a prisoner who discovered that enemies could become friends through the simple act of sharing meals. But the feast Rosemarie prepared was not just about abundance. It was about remembrance and responsibility. On her table sat both American plenty and German traditions adapted to new circumstances. Kartoffelpuffer made with Connecticut potatoes. Rotkohl prepared with ingredients Tucker had helped her source. Food that honored where she came from while celebrating where she had chosen to belong. Not all the women who had stayed had found such peace. 2 had returned to Germany after 3 years, unable to reconcile their choice with their identity. Others had struggled with depression, guilt, and the weight of decisions that could never be unmade. But most had built lives that justified their controversial choice, contributing to their adopted country while never forgetting their original homeland. Krista, now Christine Miller, worked for the State Department helping process refugees and displaced persons. She used her experience of transformation to help others navigate the impossible space between past and future. Heidi's research on starvation psychology had influenced international food aid programs, ensuring that future relief efforts understood the psychological dimensions of hunger. As Rosemarie carried the honey-glazed ham to her table, surrounded by the family she had built in this unlikely place, she thought about the young woman who had stepped off that transport truck in November 1945. That woman had believed she knew who she was and what she stood for. She had been wrong about almost everything, but in being wrong, she had been given a gift that many never received. The chance to choose again, to build identity on truth rather than propaganda, to discover that home was not where you were born, but where you chose to plant your roots and share your abundance. The feast had lasted a lifetime, not because the food never stopped, but because the lessons learned at that first overwhelming meal had shaped everything that followed.